The summer heat in London was unbearable that Tuesday morning. Marcus Thompson had been standing at his post outside Buckingham Palace for nearly 4 hours, his heavy red uniform soaking up every ray of the scorching sun. Sweat dripped down his face, but he couldn't move a muscle. As a member of the Queen's Guard, Marcus had trained for years to remain perfectly still, no matter what happened around him. Tourists gathered in front of him, taking photos and trying to make him smile or react. Children pulled funny faces while their parents laughed and pointed. Some visitors even tried to touch his uniform or get close enough to whisper jokes in his ear. Marcus had seen it all before. After 12 years of service, he had become a master at blocking out distractions. But today felt different. The temperature had already reached 35 degrees Celsius, and it was only 11 in the morning. Weather reports warned it could hit 40 degrees by afternoon. Marcus felt dizzy, and his vision started to blur slightly. He tried to focus on breathing slowly and steadily, the way his training had taught him. Behind his stoic expression, Marcus was fighting an internal battle. He thought about his daughter Sarah, who was starting university next month. The extra pay from this prestigious posting would help cover her tuition fees. He thought about his wife Emma, who worked double shifts at the hospital to support their family. He couldn't let them down by showing weakness or breaking protocol. The crowd around him grew larger as the morning progressed. Tour groups arrived in buses, and street performers set up nearby. The noise level increased, but Marcus remained focused on his duty. His commanding officer, Captain Williams, had made it clear that the summer months were crucial for maintaining the reputation of the Queen's Guard. Tourists expected perfection, and any sign of weakness would be reported in newspapers around the world. Marcus noticed an elderly woman in the crowd watching him with concern. She had been there for almost an hour, not taking photos like the others, just observing. Her name was Margaret Foster, though Marcus didn't know this yet. Margaret had been a nurse for 40 years before retiring, and she recognized the signs of heat exhaustion when she saw them. The guard's face was turning pale, and she could see tiny beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite his attempts to remain composed. The temperature continued to climb. Street vendors selling ice cream and cold drinks did excellent business as people sought relief from the heat. Even the pigeons seemed to seek shade under benches and awnings. But Marcus stood motionless, his rifle held at the perfect angle, his eyes staring straight ahead with unwavering determination. Around noon, a group of American tourists approached Marcus for photos. The family of 5 positioned themselves around him, making peace signs and silly expressions. The father, Bob Mitchell from Texas, noticed something the others missed. The guard seemed to be swaying slightly, almost imperceptibly. Bob had served in the military himself and recognized the signs of someone pushing their physical limits. "Hey, you okay there, soldier?" Bob whispered quietly, but Marcus couldn't respond even if he wanted to. The rules were absolute. No talking, no movement, no acknowledgement of anything happening around him. Bob stepped back, feeling concerned but unsure what to do. Margaret Foster had moved closer, positioning herself where she could better observe the guard. Her nursing instincts were telling her that something was seriously wrong. She watched as his breathing became slightly more labored, though he tried to hide it. The thick wool uniform and heavy bearskin hat were like wearing a furnace in this heat. A street musician started playing the violin nearby, drawing more crowds to the area. Children danced to the music while their parents enjoyed the performance. The atmosphere was festive and joyful, creating a stark contrast to Marcus's internal struggle. He could hear the music but couldn't show any reaction to it. The discipline required was enormous. Inside the palace gates, other guards were monitoring their colleagues through security cameras. Sergeant Davies had been watching Marcus closely for the past hour. He noticed subtle changes in the guard's posture and breathing that might not be visible to tourists but were concerning to a trained observer. However, protocol dictated that guards should only be relieved at scheduled intervals unless there was an emergency. The crowd continued to grow as word spread about the perfect photo opportunity. Social media posts showed Marcus as an example of British discipline and tradition. People were impressed by his ability to remain motionless despite the extreme heat. They didn't realize they were witnessing someone pushing the absolute limits of human endurance. By 12:30, the heat had become almost unbearable for everyone. Tourists sought shade under trees and in nearby cafes. Even the police officers on duty had found ways to stay cooler. But Marcus remained at his post. His training had prepared him for difficult conditions, but nothing quite like this unprecedented heat wave. Margaret Foster made a decision. She approached a nearby police officer and expressed her concerns about the guard's condition. The officer, Constable Johnson, initially dismissed her worries, explaining that the Queen's Guard were highly trained professionals who could handle extreme conditions. But Margaret's persistence and her medical background convinced him to take a closer look. Marcus could feel his heart racing as his body struggled to cope with the heat. His uniform felt like it weighed 100 pounds, and the bearskin hat seemed to be trapping all the heat around his head. He tried to use mental techniques his instructors had taught him, focusing on cool thoughts and steady breathing. He imagined himself in a cold shower or swimming in the ocean on a winter day. The crowd around him had no idea of the drama unfolding. They continued taking photos and enjoying their London sightseeing adventure. A group of schoolchildren on a field trip gathered around Marcus, their teacher explaining the history and significance of the Queen's Guard. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that he was being used as a teaching example while fighting for consciousness. As the clock approached 1 o'clock, something extraordinary began to happen. Margaret Foster wasn't the only person in the crowd who had noticed the guard's distress. Bob Mitchell, the American tourist, had been quietly spreading word among other visitors about his concerns. A small group of people had formed, not to take photos, but to keep watch over the guard they now realized might be in trouble. The street musician, noticing the growing concern, moved his performance closer to provide some distraction for the worried onlookers. Other tourists, initially annoyed by the crowd of concerned people, began to understand what was happening. A sense of collective responsibility started to emerge among strangers who had never met before but were united in their concern for this solitary figure in red. Marcus felt his legs beginning to weaken. Though he fought to maintain his rigid posture, the world around him seemed to be moving in slow motion, and the sounds of the crowd became muffled and distant. He knew he was approaching his physical limit, but his sense of duty kept him upright. In his mind, he repeated his oath of service and thought about the honor of his position. The stage was being set for something unprecedented in the history of the Queen's Guard, though nobody yet knew what was about to unfold. The temperature gauge outside the nearby gift shop read 38 degrees Celsius when Marcus felt his knees buckle for the first time. It was so subtle that most tourists didn't notice, but Margaret Foster saw it immediately. Her medical training kicked into high gear as she watched the guard's face grow increasingly pale beneath the shadow of his bearskin hat. Margaret wasn't alone in her observation anymore. Bob Mitchell had quietly gathered a small group of concerned onlookers, including a young medical student named David Chen who was visiting from Hong Kong, and a retired firefighter from Scotland named James McLeod. Without discussing it formally, they had formed an unofficial watch team, positioning themselves at different angles around Marcus to monitor his condition. Inside Buckingham Palace, the security team was becoming increasingly aware of the unusual crowd behavior. Sergeant Davies watched through the surveillance cameras as groups of tourists seemed more focused on observing the guard than photographing him. This was unusual enough to warrant attention, but not yet enough to break protocol. Marcus tried to focus on his breathing, but each breath felt like inhaling fire. The wool uniform that had been designed for cooler British weather had become a prison of heat. Sweat poured down his back, soaking his shirt completely. His rifle, which normally felt weightless in his trained hands, now seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute. The leather strap of his chin guard felt tight against his throat, making breathing even more difficult. A tour guide named Patricia Hamilton was leading a group of elderly visitors from Australia when she noticed the unusual atmosphere around the guard post. Patricia had been giving tours of London for 15 years and had never seen tourists behave quite like this before. Instead of the usual chaos of photo-taking and joke-telling, there was an almost reverent silence among those closest to Marcus. The street musician, whose name was Antonio Rossi, had been performing near the palace gates for 3 years. He knew the guard's routines better than most tourists and could sense when something was wrong. Antonio had moved his violin case closer to Marcus's position and began playing softer, more soothing melodies instead of his usual upbeat tourist favorites. He hoped the music might provide some small comfort to the struggling guard. By 1:15, the heat had reached dangerous levels. The London Weather Service had issued warnings advising people to stay indoors unless absolutely necessary. Air conditioning units across the city were working overtime, and hospitals reported increased numbers of heat-related admissions. But Marcus remained at his post, bound by duty and training that ran deeper than personal comfort. Margaret Foster made another approach to Constable Johnson, this time bringing David Chen with her. The young medical student confirmed her observations about the guard's deteriorating condition. Together, they presented a more compelling case to the officer, who finally agreed to radio his supervisor about the situation. The message went up the chain of command, eventually reaching the palace security team. Marcus could feel his vision starting to tunnel. The edges of his sight became fuzzy, and the sounds around him seemed to echo strangely. He fought to maintain his focus on a fixed point directly ahead, a technique his instructors had taught him for maintaining composure under stress. But this was beyond anything he had experienced in training or previous duty assignments. A group of Japanese tourists had been watching the developing situation with growing concern. One of them, Dr. Yuki Tanaka, was a physician visiting London with her family. She approached Margaret Foster after observing the same worrying signs in the guard's condition. The two women, despite language barriers, quickly understood each other's concerns through gestures and shared medical knowledge. The crowd around Marcus had grown to nearly 100 people, but the atmosphere was completely different from the usual tourist chaos. Word was spreading quietly through social media and messaging apps that something unusual was happening at Buckingham Palace. However, the posts weren't about entertainment or amusement. Instead, they expressed genuine concern for the guard's welfare. Captain Williams finally received the report from Constable Johnson and immediately went to observe the situation personally. From his vantage point inside the palace grounds, he could see that Marcus was indeed showing signs of distress. the captain faced a difficult decision: maintain the centuries-old tradition of unwavering guard duty or prioritize the health and safety of his soldier. Marcus felt his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. His mouth was completely dry, and he hadn't been able to swallow properly for nearly an hour. The bearskin hat felt like it was crushing his skull, and every fiber of the wool uniform seemed to be trapping more heat against his skin. Still, he remained motionless, drawing on reserves of willpower he didn't know he possessed. James McLeod, the retired firefighter, recognized the signs of severe heat exhaustion from his years of emergency response. He had seen people collapse in much less extreme conditions. James positioned himself where he could quickly reach Marcus if the guard fell. Though he wasn't sure what the protocol would be for assisting a member of the Queen's Guard, the palace medical team was now on standby, though they remained out of public view. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the chief medical officer for the palace staff, had been briefed on the situation and was prepared to respond immediately if needed. She watched through binoculars from a palace window, noting the same concerning signs that the civilians outside had observed. Antonio Rossi switched to playing classical pieces that he knew had calming effects. Without realizing it, he had become part of the support network that was forming around Marcus. The music seemed to create a bubble of tranquility in the midst of the growing tension. Other street performers in the area had also noticed something was happening and had either stopped their acts or moved to more distant locations out of respect. Social media posts about the situation began to attract attention from news outlets. A reporter from the BBC, Sarah Williams, arrived on the scene after seeing tweets about concerns for a guard's welfare. However, she quickly realized this wasn't a story to exploit but a human situation that required sensitivity and respect. Marcus's breathing had become more labored, though he tried desperately to control it. He could feel his legs trembling slightly, a sensation that terrified him because he knew it meant his body was beginning to fail. The discipline that had sustained him through years of service was being tested to its absolute limits. Dr. Tanaka and Margaret Foster had now been joined by two other medical professionals who happened to be in the crowd. Without any formal coordination, they had created an informal medical assessment team, monitoring Marcus's condition and preparing to provide assistance if he collapsed. Their presence had been noticed by Captain Williams, who was grateful for their expertise while still hoping their intervention wouldn't be necessary. The temperature continued to climb, reaching 39 degrees Celsius. Weather experts later said this was one of the hottest days London had experienced in over 50 years. The combination of direct sunlight, heavy uniform, and Marcus's unwavering dedication to duty had created a perfect storm of dangerous conditions. As 2 o'clock approached, something began to shift in the crowd's energy. What had started as individual concern was transforming into collective action. People weren't just watching anymore. They were preparing to help. The question was no longer whether Marcus would need assistance, but when and what form that assistance would take. At exactly 2:07 in the afternoon, Marcus Thompson's legs gave out completely. The collapse happened in slow motion from the perspective of those watching. First, his knees buckled slightly, then his body swayed forward, and finally, he crumpled to the ground in a heap of red wool and ceremonial brass buttons. The heavy bearskin hat rolled away from his head as he hit the pavement with a dull thud that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent crowd. For a split second, nobody moved. The sight of a Queen's Guard falling was so unprecedented, so shocking, that even the medical professionals who had been expecting it froze in disbelief. Then, as if a dam had burst, everything happened at once. Margaret Foster was the first to react, her nursing instincts overriding any concern about protocol or propriety. She rushed forward and dropped to her knees beside Marcus, immediately checking his pulse and breathing. Dr. Yuki Tanaka was right behind her, despite having to push through a crowd of stunned tourists who were still processing what they had just witnessed. "Give him space. Give him air," Margaret shouted to the crowd, which had instinctively pressed closer to see what was happening. David Chen, the medical student, helped create a barrier around Marcus while James McLeod used his commanding firefighters' voice to direct people back. Marcus was unconscious but breathing. His face was deathly pale, almost gray, and his skin was simultaneously burning hot and clammy with sweat. Margaret began the immediate treatment for heat exhaustion while Dr. Tanaka checked his vital signs. His pulse was rapid and weak, classic symptoms of severe overheating. The crowd's reaction was unlike anything anyone had ever seen at a tourist attraction. Instead of pulling out phones to record the dramatic moment, people began looking for ways to help. A woman from Canada ran to a nearby vendor and bought bottles of water. A German family offered their portable fan. Children who had been laughing and playing moments before now stood quietly with their parents, sensing the seriousness of the situation. Captain Williams had seen the collapse through the security cameras and was already rushing to the scene with the palace medical team, but he was still inside the palace grounds, and it would take him at least 3 minutes to reach Marcus. Those 3 minutes felt like an eternity to everyone watching. Antonio Rossi, the street musician, did something remarkable. Instead of stopping his music in the crisis, he began playing a gentle, almost prayer-like melody on his violin. The music seemed to provide a soundtrack for the humanitarian effort unfolding around the fallen god, creating an atmosphere of hope rather than panic. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison arrived with the palace medical team just as Margaret and Dr. Tanaka were successfully rousing Marcus back to consciousness. He opened his eyes slowly, confused and disoriented, trying to understand why he was lying on the ground surrounded by strangers. His first instinct was to try to stand up and return to his post, but gentle hands held him down. "Stay still, love," Margaret said softly, using a damp cloth someone had provided to cool his forehead. "You've had a bit of a collapse from the heat. You need to rest." Marcus tried to speak, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. "My duty. I have to ... double quotes he managed to croak before Dr. Morrison gently interrupted him. "Your duty right now is to let us take care of you," she said with the authority of someone accustomed to treating stubborn patients. Captain's orders. Captain Williams had finally arrived on the scene, and his presence seemed to provide some relief to Marcus. The captain knelt down beside his fallen soldier and spoke quietly. "You've served with honor, Thompson." "More than honor. But right now, we need to get you out of this heat." What happened next surprised everyone, including the palace officials. The crowd, which had grown to several hundred people, spontaneously began applauding. It wasn't the kind of applause you'd hear at a theater or concert. It was respectful, supportive, acknowledging not just Marcus's service but his humanity. The sound started with a few people and gradually spread through the entire gathering. Bob Mitchell, the American tourist who had first noticed Marcus's distress, found himself wiping away tears. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and understood the dedication it took to maintain discipline under extreme conditions. "That man's a hero," he said to his wife. "Not because he's in a fancy uniform, but because he pushed himself to the limit for something he believed in." As the medical team prepared to transport Marcus to a cooler location for further treatment, something unprecedented occurred. People in the crowd began offering personal items to help. A businessman removed his expensive silk tie to use as a cooling cloth. A mother donated her baby stroller to help transport Marcus's equipment. Teenagers offered their cold drinks and ice packs. Dr. Tanaka, despite being a tourist herself, stayed to assist with Marcus's care. She and Margaret Foster worked together seamlessly. 2 medical professionals from different countries and cultures united by their commitment to helping someone in need. Their collaboration became a symbol of the international cooperation happening in the crowd. The palace officials faced an unusual protocol situation. Never before had civilians been so directly involved in assisting a Queen's Guard during a medical emergency. Captain Williams made a command decision to allow the civilian medical professionals to continue helping until Marcus could be properly transported to the palace medical facilities. Marcus, now more alert but still weak, looked around at the faces surrounding him. Instead of the usual tourist cameras and silly expressions, he saw genuine concern and care from complete strangers. A little girl had placed her favorite stuffed animal next to him to make him feel better. An elderly man was fanning him with a tourist brochure. The scene was both humbling and overwhelming. Sarah Williams, the BBC reporter, found herself abandoning any thoughts of treating this as a news story. Instead, she began helping coordinate the crowd's assistance efforts, using her communication skills to organize the spontaneous relief operation. She later said it was the most meaningful work she had done in her journalism career. The heat remained brutal, but the area around Marcus had been transformed into an oasis of human kindness. People were sharing umbrellas to create shade, passing around water bottles, and taking turns fanning not just Marcus but each other. The crisis had created an instant community among strangers and neos. Violin music provided a soundtrack to the most extraordinary display of collective compassion anyone at the scene had ever witnessed. His melodies seemed to weave all the individual acts of kindness together into a symphony of human decency. Even the pigeons seemed calmer, as if sensing the peaceful energy emanating from the crowd. As Marcus slowly regained his strength with the help of cooling treatments and fluid replacement, he realized he was witnessing something remarkable. The rigid barriers between the Queen's Guard and the public had temporarily dissolved, replaced by simple human connection. The uniform that had separated him from the world had become irrelevant in the face of basic human compassion. The scene at Buckingham Palace that afternoon would soon become legendary, but not for the reasons anyone expected. What started as a medical emergency had transformed into something much more profound, a demonstration of humanity at its finest. 20 minutes after his collapse, Marcus was finally stable enough to be moved to the palace medical facility. As the medical team prepared to transport him, something extraordinary happened that would be talked about for years to come. The crowd, which had remained respectfully gathered around the scene, began forming 2 parallel lines, creating a pathway from where Marcus lay to the palace gates. Without any official instruction or coordination, hundreds of tourists from dozens of different countries had organized themselves into what looked like an honor guard for the fallen soldier. Men removed their hats, women clutched their purses quietly, and children stood solemnly beside their parents. The silence was profound and moving, broken only by Antonio's continued violin playing, which had shifted to a gentle uplifting melody. Margaret Foster and Dr. Tanaka were invited by Captain Williams to accompany Marcus during his initial treatment, an unprecedented decision that acknowledged their crucial role in his care. As they walked alongside the stretcher, Margaret found herself thinking about how a medical emergency had revealed the best of human nature among complete strangers. The Palace Medical Facility buzzed with activity as Dr. Morrison and her team worked to fully stabilize Marcus. His core body temperature had reached dangerous levels, but the quick response from the civilians had prevented what could have been a life-threatening situation. Intravenous fluids were administered to combat dehydration, and cooling measures continued to bring his temperature down to safe levels. Outside, the crowd had not dispersed as palace officials had expected. Instead, people remained in small groups, sharing stories about what they had witnessed and experienced. Bob Mitchell found himself in conversation with a family from Brazil. Despite speaking no Portuguese, somehow, they managed to communicate their shared amazement at what had just occurred using gestures, smiles, and the universal language of human kindness. The story was spreading rapidly through social media, but not in the typical way of viral content. Instead of sensationalized posts about a guard collapsing, the messages focused on the crowd's response. Videos showed people sharing water, creating shade, and working together to help a stranger. The hashtags that emerged were #humanity at its finest and #London kindness rather than anything mocking or exploitative news. Crews from various international outlets began arriving at the scene, having caught wind of the unusual story. However, they found themselves facing something they hadn't expected, a crowd that was protective of the narrative and determined to ensure the guard's dignity was preserved. Several tourists actively prevented photographers from taking potentially embarrassing shots of Marcus during his treatment. Dr. Morrison emerged from the medical facility with an update for Captain Williams and the waiting civilians. Marcus was stable, conscious, and asking about the people who had helped him. The doctor's words brought visible relief to the faces of those who had remained at the scene, many of whom had never met Marcus but felt personally invested in his recovery. James McLeod, the retired firefighter, had taken it upon himself to coordinate with palace security to help manage the crowd. His experience in emergency situations proved valuable as he worked to maintain order while allowing people to express their concern and support. He later said it was unlike any emergency response he had encountered in 30 years of service inside the medical facility. Marcus was struggling with emotions he hadn't expected to feel. The overwhelming kindness from strangers had moved him deeply, challenging his perception of the formal distance that usually existed between the Queen's Guard and the public. He asked Dr. Morrison if he could somehow thank the people who had helped him. The palace officials faced an unprecedented situation. Never before had they dealt with such extensive civilian involvement in a guard's medical emergency. Traditional protocol had no provisions for this level of public engagement, yet it was clear that trying to dismiss or minimize the crowd's contribution would be inappropriate and potentially harmful to public relations. Sarah Williams, the BBC reporter, found herself becoming an informal spokesperson for the crowd. When other media outlets arrived seeking sensational angles, she helped direct them toward the positive aspects of the story. Her colleague, a cameraman named Tom Bradley, captured footage that would later be described as some of the most moving documentary material of the year. Antonio Rossi had gradually transitioned his music from the emergency response phase to something more celebratory, reflecting the mood of cautious optimism that had settled over the crowd. His violin case was overflowing with donations from grateful tourists who recognized his contribution to maintaining a peaceful atmosphere. During the crisis, Dr. Tanaka had called her family to explain why she would be late returning to their hotel. Her husband and children were initially worried, but when she explained what had happened, her teenage daughter immediately began sharing the story online with her friends in Hong Kong. The story was beginning to spread internationally through personal networks rather than traditional media channels. Margaret Foster found herself at the center of numerous conversations with tourists who wanted to understand what they had witnessed. Many expressed surprise at their own behavior, noting that they had acted instinctively without thinking about cultural differences, language barriers, or social boundaries. The experience had revealed something fundamental about human nature that transcended these usual divisions. A group of schoolchildren who had been on a field trip when Marcus collapsed had remained with their teacher, watching the adult responses to the emergency. Their teacher, Mrs. Patricia Hamilton, realized she had just provided her students with a more valuable lesson about citizenship and compassion than any textbook would offer. The palace communications team was working to craft an official response to the growing media interest. The challenge was acknowledging the unprecedented civilian involvement while maintaining the dignity and traditions associated with the Queen's Guard. The statement would need to balance gratitude with appropriate protocol. Marcus, now feeling much stronger, was insisting that he wanted to personally thank as many of the helpers as possible. Captain Williams was initially hesitant, as this would further break from traditional protocol, but he recognized that the situation had already moved far beyond normal procedures. The human element had become more important than rigid adherence to rules. Dr. Morrison announced that Marcus would make a full recovery with proper rest and hydration. The news was met with cheers from the crowd outside, many of whom had been waiting for over an hour to hear about his condition. The fact that tourists would delay their vacation schedules to learn about a stranger's health spoke volumes about what had transpired. The afternoon heat had finally begun to subside as clouds moved in, providing natural relief that came too late for Marcus but was welcomed by everyone else. The change in weather seemed symbolic of the transformation that had occurred from a potentially tragic situation to a demonstration of human solidarity. Local vendors, inspired by the day's events, began offering free water and refreshments to the crowd. The spirit of generosity that had emerged during the crisis continued to ripple outward, affecting everyone who had been touched by the experience. Even the London pigeons seemed to sense the change in atmosphere, approaching people more boldly as if trusting in the newfound kindness. As evening approached, the crowd began to thin, but many people left contact information with palace officials, hoping to stay informed about Marcus's recovery and to maintain connections with others who had shared this extraordinary experience. The bonds formed during those critical minutes were proving to be more lasting than anyone had anticipated. 2 hours after his collapse, Marcus Thompson walked out of the palace medical facility under his own power, accompanied by Dr. Morrison and Captain Williams. Word had spread among the remaining crowd that he was ready to make an appearance, and nearly 200 people had stayed to see him. The moment he appeared at the palace gates, still in his red uniform but without the heavy bearskin hat, spontaneous applause erupted again. Marcus stopped walking and looked out at the sea of faces from around the world who had stayed to check on his welfare. For a man trained to show no emotion while on duty, this moment tested every aspect of his composure. His eyes filled with tears as he realized that these strangers had invested their precious vacation time in his well-being. Captain Williams had given him permission to speak. Another unprecedented break from protocol. "I don't know how to thank you properly," Marcus began, his voice still slightly hoarse from the heat exhaustion. "In 12 years of service, I've stood at this post thousands of times, but I've never experienced anything like what happened today. You didn't just save my life, you showed me something beautiful about humanity that I'll never forget." Margaret Forster, who had remained throughout his treatment, stepped forward from the crowd. "You don't need to thank us, love. We're just glad you're all right. You showed us something too, what dedication and service really look like. We're honored to have been here." Dr. Tanaka approached with her family, who had finally arrived to see what had kept their wife and mother so long. Her husband bowed respectfully to Marcus, a gesture that seemed to bridge cultural differences effortlessly. Their teenage daughter, who spoke excellent English, translated her father's words. "He says you are a true warrior, and our family is proud to have helped you today." Bob Mitchell walked up with his wife and 3 children, each carrying something small. "These are from Texas," he said, handing Marcus a small flag pin. "My kids wanted you to have something to remember that people from all over the world were here for you today." His youngest daughter, barely 6 years old, stepped forward shyly and gave Marcus a drawing she had made of him in his red uniform, surrounded by smiling stick figures labeled helpers from everywhere. The gifts kept coming, creating an impromptu international exchange. A couple from Sweden offered a small wooden horse, a traditional symbol of strength. An elderly Japanese man presented a origami crane folded from his tourist map, explaining through gestures that it represented hope and recovery. A family from South Africa shared homemade biltong from their travel snacks, insisting that Marcus needed protein to rebuild his strength. Antonio Rossi approached with his violin case and performed a special piece he said he had composed during the afternoon, inspired by what he had witnessed. The melody captured the progression from crisis to hope to celebration, and as he played, others in the crowd began humming along, creating an impromptu concert right there at the palace gates. James MacLeod presented Marcus with a small patch from his old fire department in Scotland. "This is from Station 42 in Edinburgh," he said. "We give these to people who show exceptional courage under pressure. Today, you earned it twice, once for your service, and once for letting us help you when you needed it." Sarah Williams had been documenting these exchanges with her camera crew, but she approached Marcus not as a reporter but as someone who had been moved by the experience. "I've covered news stories all over the world," she told him, "but I've never seen anything like what happened here today. This isn't just news, it's a reminder of what people can be when they're at their best." David Chen, the medical student, had stayed throughout the afternoon because he said the experience was better than any lesson he could learn in a textbook. He presented Marcus with his student medical kit, saying, "Keep this with you on hot days. Today taught me that medicine isn't just about knowledge, it's about people caring for each other." The palace communications team had been watching these interactions with amazement. What had started as a potential public relations crisis had transformed into one of the most positive stories associated with the Queen's Guard in recent memory. The official palace statement, when it was finally released, focused entirely on gratitude for the public's compassionate response. Marcus found himself in conversation after conversation with people who had traveled thousands of miles to visit London. only to find themselves part of an unexpected human drama. A family from Australia had changed their entire itinerary to stay and see if he was okay. Newlyweds from India had spent their honeymoon afternoon caring for a stranger instead of sightseeing, and they said it had been the most meaningful part of their trip. Captain Williams watched these interactions with a mixture of pride and amazement. The strict protocols he had enforced for years had been designed to maintain dignity and tradition. But he was witnessing something that transcended those formal boundaries. The humanity his God had shown by accepting help had created connections that would last far beyond this single afternoon. Dr. Morrison joined the gathering to provide a final medical update. Marcus's vital signs were completely normal. His temperature had returned to safe levels, and he showed no signs of lasting effects from the heat exhaustion. She also announced that the palace medical team was implementing new protocols for extreme heat days, ensuring that no guard would face such dangerous conditions alone again. The crowd began to thin as evening approached, but the departures were unlike typical tourist displays. People exchanged contact information, promising to stay in touch and share photos. Some planned to meet again the next day before leaving London. Others made commitments to visit each other's countries. Connections formed in the crucible of shared compassion. A local news crew interviewed several of the participants, asking why they had stayed so long and gotten so involved with a stranger's medical emergency. The answers were remarkably consistent across different languages and cultures. They had felt compelled to help. They had been moved by Marcus's dedication to duty, and they had discovered something special about human nature that they wanted to preserve and remember. Marcus spent nearly an hour personally thanking individuals in the crowd, learning their names, hearing their stories, and exchanging small tokens of appreciation. Each interaction reinforced his sense that this day had changed him fundamentally. The formal distance he had maintained as part of his professional identity had been replaced by a genuine human connection. As the sun began to set over London, casting long shadows across the palace grounds, the last group of helpers prepared to leave. They had created an informal network, planning to stay connected through social media and promising to share updates about Marcus's continued service. The guard who had stood alone at his post that morning was now part of an international community. The palace staff had documented the afternoon's events carefully, recognizing that they had witnessed something historically significant. The rigid traditions of the Queen's Guard had proven flexible enough to accommodate genuine human need, creating a precedent that would influence protocols for years to come. Marcus stood at the palace gates as the final tourists departed, still wearing his red uniform but forever changed by the experience. The man who had collapsed from heat exhaustion had been transformed by the kindness of strangers into something more than a symbol of British tradition. He had become a living reminder of humanity's capacity for compassion. 6 months after that scorching Tuesday afternoon, Marcus Thompson stood at his usual post outside Buckingham Palace, but everything had changed. The story of his collapse and the crowd's extraordinary response had become legendary, shared across social media platforms, featured in documentaries, and studied in universities as an example of spontaneous human cooperation during crisis situations. The immediate aftermath had been overwhelming. Within 24 hours, videos of the event had been viewed millions of times worldwide. News outlets from every continent covered the story, but remarkably, the coverage remained positive and respectful. The narrative that emerged wasn't about a guard's moment of weakness, but about humanity's capacity for instant compassion among strangers. Marcus received over 10,000 messages from people around the world. Letters arrived at Buckingham Palace from schoolchildren, medical professionals, military veterans, and ordinary citizens who had been moved by what they witnessed or heard about. The palace mailroom had to create a special system just to handle the correspondence related to Marcus's story. Margaret Foster had returned to her home in Yorkshire, but she and Marcus had maintained regular contact. She had become something of a celebrity in her community, invited to speak at medical conferences about emergency response and the importance of civilian first aid training. Her quick action that day had inspired dozens of people in her town to take first aid courses. Dr. Yuki Tanaka had returned to Japan, where Marcus's story became a case study in her medical school lectures. She used the experience to teach her students about cross-cultural cooperation in emergency situations and the universal nature of medical compassion. Her family had started a small foundation supporting international medical exchange programs. Bob Mitchell's children had never stopped talking about the day they met a real hero in London. The experience had sparked their interest in public service, and his eldest son had decided to pursue a career in emergency medicine. Bob himself had become a volunteer with veterans organizations in Texas. Inspired by Marcus's dedication to duty and service, Antonio Rossi, the street musician, had composed a full symphony inspired by the events of that day. The piece, titled Humanity's Symphony, had been performed by the London Symphony Orchestra as a charity benefit for heat-related emergency research. Antonio still performed near Buckingham Palace, but now tourists often recognized him as the violinist from that amazing day. The changes at Buckingham Palace had been significant and lasting. New protocols had been implemented for extreme weather conditions. With additional water stations, cooling areas, and mandatory rotation schedules during heat waves, the Queen herself had privately commended Marcus for his service and had ordered a formal review of guard duty procedures during extreme conditions. Captain Williams had been promoted following his handling of the situation. His decision to allow civilian medical professionals to assist had been praised by senior officials as an example of putting human welfare above rigid protocol when circumstances demanded it. The incident had become a case study in military leadership training programs. Marcus discovered that his story had inspired changes far beyond the palace gates. Hospitals worldwide had reported increases in civilian first aid course enrollments. Tourism organizations had begun training their guides in basic emergency response. The video of strangers working together to help him had been used in corporate team-building presentations and university sociology courses. The international connections forged that day had grown into lasting relationships. A social media group created by David Chen had attracted over 50,000 members from around the world, all inspired by the story to share acts of kindness in their own communities. The group organized annual gatherings, with many of the original helpers reuniting each year on the anniversary of Marcus's collapse. James McLeod had used his experience to develop new training protocols for emergency responders, focusing on how to effectively coordinate with civilian helpers during public crises. His innovations had been adopted by fire departments across Scotland and had attracted attention from emergency services internationally. Sarah Williams had won a journalism award for her coverage of the story, but more importantly to her, she had changed how she approached reporting. The experience had reminded her that the most powerful stories often emerged from focusing on human dignity and compassion rather than conflict and controversy. Marcus himself had become an unexpected ambassador for both the Queen's Guard and international goodwill. He had been invited to speak at conferences, visit schools, and participate in cultural exchange programs. However, he remained committed to his primary duty and continued to serve at his post with the same dedication that had impressed the world. That summer day, the physical location where Marcus had collapsed had become an informal pilgrimage site. Tourists from around the world made special trips to visit the spot, often leaving flowers or small tokens of appreciation. The palace had installed a discreet plaque acknowledging the International Day of Compassion that had spontaneously emerged there. Letters continued to arrive regularly, many from people sharing their own stories of receiving help from strangers or being inspired to help others. Teachers wrote about using Marcus's story to teach their students about citizenship and kindness. Medical students described how the story had influenced their understanding of patient care and community health. On the 6-month anniversary of the event, many of the original helpers returned to London for an unofficial reunion. Margaret Foster, Dr. Tanaka, Bob Mitchell and his family, Antonio Rossi, James McLeod, and dozens of others gathered at the palace gates. Marcus, with special permission from his superiors, was able to take a brief break from his duties to greet them personally. The reunion was covered by international media, but the focus remained on the lasting friendships and connections that had emerged from those crucial minutes of crisis and compassion. Children who had been present 6 months earlier had grown and changed, but they still remembered the day everyone helped the soldier man. Dr. Morrison presented research findings from the palace medical team's study of the incident. The rapid civilian response had been medically crucial to Marcus's recovery and had prevented what could have been serious complications from heat stroke. Her presentation had been published in medical journals and was being used to train emergency responders worldwide. The Queen herself had requested a private meeting with Marcus, an honor rarely bestowed upon individual guards, though the details of their conversation remained confidential. Palace sources indicated that Her Majesty had expressed personal gratitude for his service and pride in the positive international attention the incident had brought to British values of service and community. As evening approached on the anniversary day, Antonio Rossi played his violin one more time at the palace gates. The melody he chose was the same gentle tune he had played during Marcus's treatment 6 months earlier. The crowd that had gathered for the reunion fell silent, many wiping away tears as they remembered the transformative experience they had shared. Marcus returned to his post as the sun set over London, but he was no longer the same man who had stood there alone that sweltering Tuesday morning. He had learned that duty and humanity weren't opposing forces but could work together to create something beautiful. The rigid soldier had discovered that showing vulnerability could be a form of strength, and that accepting help could be as noble as providing it. The story of the royal guard who collapsed in the heat had become more than a news item or social media phenomenon. It had become a reminder that, in a world often divided by differences, human compassion could bridge any gap. Marcus Thompson had started that day as a symbol of British tradition and ended it as a symbol of universal human kindness. As tourists continued to visit Buckingham Palace, many came specifically to see the guard post where ordinary people from around the world had proven that extraordinary compassion was always possible when someone needed help. The legacy of that scorching afternoon lived on in the thousands of small acts of kindness it had inspired worldwide.